Have you ever worked with a software development team to build your product for your stealth startup? Your engineer is boasting about their DevOps teams, their approach to continuous integration, and the methodology that they use to build your native or cross-platform application. And this was just the beginning of the presentation, let alone when words such as deep tech, AI gets thrown in. Way more jargons to go. No wonder it sometimes feels like a minefield building a platform as a non-tech founder. In this episode, we've teamed up with Joel Yeap to help you demystify, or shall I say, understand jargons. We look at best practices, what to watch out for, and what kind of questions to ask so that you can comfortably hold your hands when talking to tech people. Welcome to the Mary Poppins of Startups live show. I'm Naily Makangu from Athena Leaders. As a tech consultant and startup advisor, I will answer live the burning question that you have on your way to Series A+. Subscribe and tune in every week for top tips to meet amazing guests like Joel, startup founders, investors, and more. More importantly, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Joel, welcome to the show. For those who don't know you, Joel works with purpose-led founders trying to find their way through tech. Joel uses many principles such as design sprints to take founders' vision of a solution and break it into chunks to test the fundamentals and build it step by step until you get to the desired MVP. And what is really special about having Joel on the show today is that Joel started his journey as a non-tech person that was dumped into the world of tech and had to navigate and swim across the world of jargons until he is now at the point where he helps startups do the same. Joel, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about what you do in your company?
For sure. Thanks so much, Nali, for that introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here with you today. So I started out, like you said, completely non-technical. I studied politics at university, so about as far as I can get from technology. And it's quite an interesting journey. So I ended up moving here to Sweden, where I am now, because I met a girl, and then COVID happened. And so there was a lot of industries that were not hiring as actively. So I was trying to figure out what to do. And technology was one of those places that really didn't mind working a bit remotely. And so they brought me in for project management. So I started off working at a software development agency. And like you said, I knew nothing about tech. So it was straight into the deep end for me, and trying to figure out how do I work with designers, software developers, testers, and create a desired outcome for somebody on what they want to build. So that's really where I started getting into tech and learning how do I work with all of these different competencies and different people that have very varying understandings of technology, and how do we communicate across that. So I was doing that for a long time, and then about 6 months ago, I decided I would shoot off on my own, because I felt that the agency world was not offering the valuable advice that a lot of startup founders really needed. So that's where I kind of work now, and it's quite end to end, from the idea of what I want to create and what value I want to add, to designing and developing that solution alongside founders to help them find who they want to work with, so that we can onboard users at that MVP and start really growing that startup business, so they have confidence through that process.
And I guess, as you might have seen a few times in the world of startups, especially tech startups, there are many people. It's not just the technical people that turn up and they have an idea or wants to build something. Usually you might have some founders that have zero technical background, and some people might not even be used to, or the way I used to say that the people who still use is paper when it comes to writing down notes or calendars and agenda meetings. Those people still exist these days. So coming on wherever you are on your journey, and however much you might have used computers or your phone, it's a completely different ball games when you start working with tech startup or with technical people and technical teams. Now, one of the misconceptions that we were talking about this just before we started the show, I thought I might as well put it in here now. One of the misconceptions that people have is that tech people understand all of the jargons and everything that happens in the tech world. I don't know if you ever seen that, or you ever thought about that, or you haven't seen that applied as well.
Yeah, it was quite interesting when you mentioned it, because I, as a non-technical person, had come in with that assumption that most tech people can understand one another completely fine, and they're all on the same page for it. And I hadn't thought that actually there's probably a lot of jargon that we might be using differently, even amongst technical people. So it was quite interesting to hear your perspective. And so I haven't got any examples that come to mind, but I don't know about you. Maybe you've got some stuff that stumped you when you were talking to technical people.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things that I see a lot is when people, because obviously tech is vast, as I've said before, there are different elements of even just programming languages. Whenever you talk to people who are non-tech, it expects an engineers to be able to talk or write in many different languages. Yet when you start looking for a job as an engineer, you might also look at the preference of which programming languages to use. Of course, you can switch from Java to C++ or to whatever exists out there, but it's completely different. And as well, the other big thing is the fact that different departments do different things. So where you work, you probably use the jargon that you use a lot. But when it comes to working with another team, it kind of depends. For me, the biggest jargon, which I think it's something that we say a lot, is things like agile, right? Agile or DevOps. Those are concepts that non-technical people will get used to. Technical people understand to a certain level, but the application of DevOps and what it actually means and what Agile means for a company really varies, and different teams will also use them differently. So for me, it's really important. I mean, my first advice that I have to non-technical founders, or to anybody really working with a technical team, is to appreciate the gift of documentation. And I think one of the first things to start with is, I think it's a document that you put together, Joel, that has a lot of jargons there and define them so that people can use that as the common language. Do you want to share with us a little bit more about, I think it's a version 2 of a cool document that you're putting together for non-tech founders, right?
Yeah, so I posted it, I think, a couple of weeks ago. I started working on my second version of it. And it's really something that came out from my own needs, and trying to figure out, okay, how do there's the two parts. One was for myself. How do I make sure that I understand a lot of these terms so that when I hear it, I can understand what's going on in the conversation, and also push myself to learn new things that I probably should know, was a big part of that. And then as well, I can use it as a tool to help other people that maybe they're trying to begin in technology as a founder, and they're from a non-technical background. How do they understand what's going on around them? And it's because when I first started, if I heard too much technical jargon going on around me, it it made my head start of kind of switch off, because I would like maybe latch on to one word and be just like stuck, and then the whole conversation would leave me behind, and I couldn't get engaged and involved, and that's really held me back. So being comfortable to understand terms, to try and find terms, was a really big part of helping me to get involved in technology and to work with it at a better level.
Yes. One thing that always makes me laugh when I go on demos, especially demos of certain features, it's also very interesting to see how the developers might demo their features, because there are different types of demo. There's one where you pretty much have all of the departments, and usually it's more about usability and the functionality. And by that I mean, if I'm developing an app to let's say to have a fancy login screen, you might think a login screen is super easy to make, but it's not that easy. Trust me. I just want to see what are the main features with that. Yet when you go to some demos, sometimes one of the mistakes I've seen a lot of developers to do, they don't really appreciate who am I demoing to and what level of deep information they need. I've been in a demo where someone was going code by code, line of code. They were going through that. They were going through the database, how they built the database. And I thought, this is great. I find it fascinating and I'm really enjoying this. But the CEO is on this call of the startup I was working with. The CEO is on this call with other people from product and other people from the sales department. None of them are actually interested in that level of details. So I can imagine you being a project manager sitting there and going like, oh, what the hell is going on right now?
Yeah, I have been in a few of them, and yeah, it's a fine line because they want to share something important with you, and
Mm-hmm.
try to explain it, but also you don't want to waste each other's time, and you want to make sure you get what you need from that conversation, and it's quite tough to
Yeah.
sometimes just drag it back and be like, hey, this is not helpful for me, I don't understand it, this is the piece that I need
Mm-hmm.
to understand, can you help me with that? And it depends who you're working with, and some people are like super great at it, and some
Yeah.
people, it takes them a little bit of time to get on the same page with you about it. um,
Yes.
but yeah, I've 100% been there where it's different people are coming in with different requirements and trying to have one
Mm-hmm.
person demoing to communicate to many different levels. It's really tough.
Yeah.
I don't envy them.
Yeah. And you mentioned the word requirements, which is one of my favorite words. How do you help? How do you help your clients, or whether in your business or even before when you're working for the agency? How do you help navigate the word of requirements so that it can be understood at different level by many different people?
Mm, that's a very dangerous word, let's say. Requirements.
Yes.
And it changes actually depending on what I was doing before and how I work now. And I think that's one of the big things that I learned when I decided to work for myself, was the different perspectives that I've had, as I've learned and developed. And so a lot of the time, requirements can just mean, what do I need to build exactly? Just give me the blueprints of the box, and I will go ahead and build it. And that's how it was for me as an agency worker. Was, what do you want to build in your scope? Give me the features that you want. What do you want your users to do? And then I can write out a document that explains the flow, make sure that I've got those flows understood, and then we can take it to the team and then break it down into epics and stories, which is another piece of jargon, but basically exactly what each user should be able to do throughout a flow, such as a login flow. And then what I've kind of switched away from that is towards the deciding with the founder what are the requirements for their target user, um, which is slightly different from how I did it before, because now it's not just about what does the founder want, but also how do we know that that decision is the right thing for the project and for those users. And it then you have to go and validate the scope actually, and go talk to users and um, create prototypes to test before you go ahead and build. And that I've found is really helpful, because it means that the requirements are much leaner on average,
Mhm.
and they're also more impactful, because they're kind of um, distilled into what is the real valuable piece for users, and that's more useful when we go to build and release. So that I find that's a better process of having a guideline of requirements, testing it, and then distilling that requirements into what is really needed for your users, and then writing it out in a very clear and self-explanatory way, so that uh, hopefully anyone can understand it. And then there's the communication part to make sure it's understood.
Yes, and I definitely love the emphasis that you've made there in terms of making sure that when you're writing down the requirements or you're gathering the requirements, it's actually understood from the perspective of the user as well. What is that the user wants to get out of that? I've seen a lot of projects getting started without a full understanding of what is important for the users, how they go, why it's even important for them, and that usually leads to some problems down the line. Because again, for me, when someone has your idea you have in your head, you've been thinking about that. Let's say you're creating a dating app, for example, you've been thinking about the dating app and what the new features needs to be, and you spend so much time in that it makes sense to you that sometimes when it comes to the communication of what needs to be built in details, there's a lot of shortcuts and there's a lot of things that gets overlooked because people assume that it's clear. For me, just to add one more thing on the requirements, for me, especially when it comes to writing down, one key thing to do is clarity of language is super important. It's not what you assume this word means that the other person will also understand. My favorite example again is a logging screen. And when I ask people, someone, for example, you're building your app, what is more important for you? And they will say quality, right? So how do you define quality? So Joel, let's try and play this example. If someone comes to you with very little information, whatever app they are doing, whether it's a dating app or is a traveling app, whatever it is, and they say that they want you to focus on quality, how would you interpret that word?
That's a very tough word because it's so vague. My initial thought is quality in the design, have a really high quality user experience. And I go with that because I think most non-technical people, so it depends on the person I'm talking to, but most non-technical people, for them, quality is the experience of the user and how it looks visually, because that's what they're going to be really seeing, which can sometimes mean the code quality suffers a little bit.
Yeah.
But for me, that's where I go to immediately. It's the design side first. For
See,
you?
for me, when I'm wearing my engineer hat, when someone say that they want quality, I'm more likely to give them a very basic UI and make sure that everything works smoothly. So whenever they click on buttons on the screen, they get the information very quickly. The application, whenever you turn it on, it loads very quickly. There's not what we call bugs, which are errors in the systems. And that's where I will go. And of course, as you can see, if Joel and I were working in a team and a client come to us and say, and they keep on emphasizing the word quality without defining exactly what they mean by quality. Do they want us to prioritize the interface of what you see on the screen? Or do they want us to prioritize more the thing that you don't see, but the working and how something works? Or do they want a bit of a balance of the two? I mean, one of the reasons why I think it's really important is because especially early stage startups, when you're first building a product, you have a limited amount of money, and the way you define your requirements and where you want the emphasis to be plays a huge part in what you get. There are some people who say, oh, I work with this company and I've told them to build this travel app, but then when I got it, they didn't have features for messaging internally. I'm like, yeah, but did you actually define that? And how did you define that so for people to be able to understand that?
Yeah, that's a really good point as well there on, I wanted instant messaging, but it wasn't included. How did you define it? And I found that's one of the biggest problems, especially with early stage startups, is you don't know all of your thinking necessarily at the start. And you want that flexibility to be able to change your mind throughout the development process. And I don't know how it was for you when you were an engineer. For me, when I was working with development teams and you have a project, you want to get it on time and on budget. Changing requirements halfway through is like a nightmare, and really don't want to have that happening.
Yeah.
So yeah, a lot of what I do now, I try to find a way to keep it so that the amount of changes that we have to do is really minimal, and we keep that lead time quite quick so that we can iterate faster. But I don't know how it was for you.
No, it's pretty much the same. I think the best analogy I have when it comes to building a software is a bit like you are creating a car. So imagine you are, a lot of people have seen. I have an idea of how cars are built. Obviously you have the chassis of the car, then eventually they put the wheels, eventually they put the shield. Or I don't know which order they go, but that's the different components get put on the car. Now imagine if they've already done the chassis of the car, and the structure of the car is based, they know exactly how much space when they were curving and chopping up the metals. They know how much space there was left for the wheel and the tires and things like that. If you come back halfway through, so people are there chopping and putting things together, and says, oh, by the way, we made a big mistake. We don't want to have this type of tires. We want to have completely different types of tires. That should just be something small that you can add on top of that. Of course, it really depends on how far you've gone into the building of the car. Does it mean that you have to retrofit what you've cut off? I mean, if you've cut too much and you can't cut anymore, then do we need to kind of rebuild another part and then solder them together? There's always those questions that happen. And when you look at like mechanical things or parts or components that you can see, it's a lot more easier to understand for people. But the same happens to software as well. So as an engineer, we end up building things. It's kind of layering. It's a bit like a jigsaw puzzle, really. You layer things on top of each other. So when someone comes and wants a fundamental change, we need to go back and figure out at what points far back do we need to start changing and really unknitting the stuff so that you can knit them back together the way you want. So that's why it's really important to make sure that your requirements are as clear as possible. And if, again, what is also very important to say is that the world of software and tech, things changes very quickly. So a good architecture would have been done in a way that will allow you to make some changes. But bear in mind that nothing comes for free. So the more you change a lot, the more it has impact on your software as well.
Yeah, for sure. It's a cool way to think of it.
Yeah. Now, another of the tools or tips that I wanted to share in this session is about the power of visual brainstorming or working with people to have a lot of visual just in addition to written words. Is there something that you also use at some extent as part of the work that you do with technical teams?
Within kind of the scoping stage, let's say. Is that right?
Especially the scoping stage, the requirement stage, and I mean throughout the work that you're doing.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I really think of most projects as having kind of 3 separate stages. And so I like to make sure that we finish one stage before we move to the next one. And so it really starts with that kind of ideation, discovery stage at the start. And that has loads of sketching. And the end of that is when we properly scope out. And that's because we've understood the problem, we've understood the users, we start coming up with solutions and we scope those solutions. And then I do a lot of sketching. So I grab a bunch of papers. I'm usually sitting with a team and it's just pen and paper, drawing user flows on what a user interface might look like, just roughly. And that really helps to take the broad, fluffy concept of I want my user to be able to do this thing, like, I don't know, book a flight in your travel app example. But it really shows the whole flow that they need to go through by doing that. And then once we've gone through that, we've scoped it, then we go and validate with users. And so then I always say, start with paper-based. And so then we kind of go into the designs phase, which is step 2. And it's just, here's a bunch of papers, sit down with some users and help them to go through a flow and see how they actually go through it. And if it makes sense, doesn't make sense. And if it doesn't make sense, and for something really clearly, we don't go into like UX design and wireframing properly, because that can cost a lot to get good designers in. So let's make sure that what we want them to design is tested first. And then if the paper prototypes work well, then it's drawing out those wireframes for the UX team. Then we do the UI. And then once all of that is done, we kind of have a really good framework for what the front end of the project should look like. That's another piece of jargon. And then we go into the development phase, which is where we kind of start building out all of the back end and the actual front end of the applications. So
yeah, brilliant. Yes, I definitely love your method. And for those who don't know, how would you define a wireframe?
Oh my gosh. You're giving me some work here.
Yeah.
I think of wireframes as the very simple flow for what I want my users to go through, but designed in a way that it actually looks like what an app could look like. So you can take any app that you use, maybe dial it back like 30% on some of the details, and I usually go black and white so that there's less stuff to get frustrated by, because when it's like, oh, I'm not sure about this color, it's like, that's not so helpful just yet.
Yes.
It's a good point, but so black and white saves you all that hassle, and you don't get biased by colors and things like that. And it's just about seeing how does the sequence of steps that a user takes to achieve the desired outcome that you want. And it can start really rough, but the goal is actually at the end of the wireframe phase, I would like it to be pretty strong, very clear on exactly what we're going to look like. And then we just have to apply colors really, and alignment and things like that, so that you're getting really high quality insights from users when they're testing it, and you can make clickable prototypes out of that as well, which is helpful.
Yeah, and I think I love your idea or your methods of keeping it on black and white. As I mean, every time I go in a meeting, and we do a design meeting especially, and you've got all of those screens and you've developed the wireframes. So for example, if you want to talk to someone about what is the journey that someone will take to book a flight, so they will come in here, they will log in, and then the next screen they will see will be the screen where they will have to put their destination, and then the screen for the price. So people can see all of that. But sometimes when there's a lot of details, as you've mentioned in the design, people get so into this button should have been here and there, which I think that yes is useful depending on what level of the conversation we're in, but sometimes it's not. It can be a bit of a distraction. Another keyword I wanted to add as well as part of this what we're looking into the wireframe. A lot of people always ask about UI UX, so that's user interface and user experience, is engineers or designers, depending on what you want to call them. And I think they're really important to have. Some people might not want to have UI UX when they first start their projects, depending on the budget that they have. But I would say if you do have the budget to bring them on as early on, they're great because they will help you understand exactly how the user will think, how they should flow from one stage to the next. And then when you go into the building, as we've mentioned, the engineers know exactly what to expect. But sometimes, let's face it, when you first start as a early stage startup, you might be limited on budget. So the advice is pretty much to do as Joel has nicely explained in terms of going through different stages. You can do that on your own or work with specialists like Joel to help you to guide you along the way. But you can also use things as simple as PowerPoints. Sometimes people go, they overdo it a little bit, or maybe they want to use too many software. And if you're not from a technical background and it takes you a lot of time, it still helps your team. Even if you just go on something as simple as PowerPoint, you kind of draw a circle with things that you want them to see. There are things like Figma, which you can also use. I think that there's a free license for you to start with, to experiment with. And Figma is another great way of being able to see what the screen should look like. And it's very, very important. The second thing, again, I think, Joel, that'll be interesting for you as the conversation between the technical brain and the non-technical brain. From the technical brain's perspective, what is very interesting is, as I'm coding, right? I'm a software engineer by trade. So when I write code, we really look at the interface of codes, but we really want to make sure that things works really well. And for us, it's really how can we make things work? If we see something that doesn't sound quite right or look quite right in the design, we can point that out. But our main skill set is making things work. Now, when we look at UI and UX, think of them a bit like one type of architects, right? Their job is to make sure that if someone is coming to a house, they open a door, they're not going to fall through because there was nothing in there, or they made a mistake. Or if you are designing steps, how big the steps needs to be so that people, depending on the age of, if it's a house, you have young kids, all those things are taken care of. And me as an engineer, I need to make sure I will look a lot more in terms of the material. What kind of material are we going to put there? How is this going to affect the walls and the things nearby? So that's why it's important whenever you are thinking about hiring, as you're scaling your startup, to start thinking as well about those type of skill sets you want to bring in the company. If you're getting a lot of feedback from user and says, "Oh, we love your app, but it's a bit clunky," then start thinking about bringing UI UX experts to help you with the interface. If you have a beautiful shiny interface and they think that is missing functionalities, then that could be a spectrum of things. It could be from the designs, it could be from the way it's been built, or it could have just been a decision that you wanted to have less features to begin with. So I wanted to kind of just share share this aspect of the technical brain, as Joel, you nicely put the non-technical and how to start with there as well.
Yeah, I really like that thinking as well, and that analogy that you use with the house, because I think it's 100% right. Is you need to understand where the value is from each person, and it's that combination of skills and how they interact with each other that is super powerful. When you have that design team and the development team that work really well together, and like you said, the designer might show one way to, let's say, load a screen, or they might not even show how to load it, but they just say, you're going to go from here to here. Then a developer might have, well, how do we want to load it? And there might be 3 different ways. And there might be one way that's better for users, or there might be one way that's just really easy to code and it's going to save us so much time. And there's lots of different small interactions like this that separates a really good flowing project and one that might have a few hiccups and not get done as efficiently. And I think, like you said, that it's that interaction there between two brains that really creates magic.
Yes. And in fact, this leads me to the next point that we were discussing, was the what, why, and how to use that principle. Sometimes I find non-tech founders or non-tech people on the team, even you, Joel, you may have seen that as an experience as a project manager. You might get an engineer that are building a feature, they come to you and they say it's done. And then you're not really sure whether it was done. For you, like, have you actually done it the way I expected? Is this feature working the way I expected? Or how can a non-technical person even know whether it was built the right way? And that's one of the headaches that a lot of non-tech founders have, is making sure, how can they make sure that the code was written the right way? So is there any kind of advice or anything that you've seen in the past that also maybe you have felt that way, or anything you want to share on that point?
Yeah. So if I make sure that I understood you right, it's about someone comes and says something is done. How do I know it's actually done? Right?
Yes.
Okay. I think there's a few things with this one actually that makes it a bit tricky, right? So there's the first part, which is the definition of done can be different for different people, and so whenever I write out requirements, even if it's just for small tasks, I try to have very clear definition of done, and so then we can have an agreement of, is it actually done or not? Can we do X, Y, and Z? And that's helpful for making sure that at least functionally it should be done. And I ask for demos and stuff like that a lot if I'm not 100% convinced that it is going to match it.
Yes.
So it's just like, show me that it works. And if it does do what we agreed it would do, then okay, that's one check mark. If it doesn't, then I say, hey, look, what did you understand? Because this doesn't match what we said. And then we need to have a conversation. Am I miscommunicating? Are they not listening properly or not reading things properly? And that's a fun thing as a project manager to be doing. But then the next layer is kind of comes back to quality, I think, and what you said before, right? So it depends a little bit on what you need, especially when we talk about like code quality and definition of done. In that sense, you might have one way of writing it that achieves the result functionally, but might have scalability issues. That's a bit of a problem. And you need to think then about what is it that you need from this platform. Is it really just a small test thing that doesn't need to scale, or do we really need this thing to scale? Then we need to take these things very seriously. And I think as a non-technical person, you've got some limitations there. You can learn how to do stress testing or do things like that. That's going to reveal these issues, but that's still a limitation. Another thing, what I do, because I'm non-technical, is I actually have a few people that I trust that I work with. And I don't normally get them in to build the whole thing, because that might be expensive or quite time consuming, but I might ask them to either help with kind of code review or just accepting pull requests or accepting what code can come in and out, so that they have a more overviewing role, and it helps to maintain a good enough level dependent on what quality we need and what our limitations and requirements are, to try and get things done properly.
Brilliant. And you've shared quite a lot of things there. So let's kind of break them apart, because you've mentioned, definition of done, which I love that you also have that in your requirements, so that can be used for user acceptance testing. So once, for those who don't know what's, the definition of done is, you can, for example, if you have a booking up, you have a different example to say that for these features to have been built the right way, as a user, I want to be able to do X, Y, Z, and this is how I will be able to do that. I will put this information as a name, as a login, as a password, and when I click on the button, that works. So that helps the development team, so that when they are testing, they know exactly what's to happen. The other things that I love that you've mentioned was both on on the code review, and also on having that person that you can speak to, that that comes in and can review the things. So how would you define a code review for those who've never heard of that before? I should have said there will be like an example, Joel.
This is a little bit tricky because I take it as a non-technical person, and so I just take it from a distance. And there's different ways. So when I work as part of a team and we have a lot of developers, I usually have one person who is usually the senior developer. They know their stuff. They've got a track record of delivering good results. They help me set up what are the standards, what are our expectations, how are we going to run this? And they I get them in to help me manage everyone else that might be doing stuff. And so then they have their acceptance criteria. They decide what is good enough and what is not good enough, and we need to redo it. And so then I ask them to check every time someone completes a piece of work and wants to submit it. I'm trying to not use too much jargon here, and like no pull requests, no GitHub and repositories. So yeah, someone completes a piece of code and they want to submit their work. They quickly review it, test that it makes the right results, and then if it does, then they will accept it and include it. So that's one way of just keeping on top of it as you go. But then again, I think there's also a lot of stages where you need to review things and take a step back, because it's hard sometimes when you're just looking at a small piece to understand how it fits in on a larger scale. So particularly one thing that I was not usually so good at, and I'm working to get much better at, is actually having milestones where we go back and we refactor, which is another piece of jargon, which basically just says we go back, we check what we've done, and is there anything that needs updating? If there's anything redundant that we need to remove, just to make sure that the quality is kind of kept on top of. So that's a big part. Another thing in code review is at the end of a project, especially if you're from outside and kind of coming in, or you take it to a third party and you say, hey, look, this is what we've done. Can you just review, make sure that there's nothing that's really obvious that we've missed that should have been done? Like, could be something on security that got forgotten. That would be a big problem. Or it could be just poor standards that needed to get improved. And if no one on the team knows it, then someone else needs to lift up that standard, right? So that's a little bit on code review, I think. But I don't want to get too far.
No, I think you've explained it beautifully. And I think code review was a big part of the work that we used to do. And for me, having a team that do not have code review is always an alarm bell ringing. So when I go into an organization and look at the development teams and the work that they do, if there's no code review, my first question is why? Why don't you have any code review? How do you make sure that people are doing the right thing? So again, I'm a big fan of analogy. For me, when you look at code review, think about it as if you're writing an article for a blog piece. It could even be an article for a blog piece, but there are maybe 2 or 3 different authors. You have the full article, the theme of the article, but each author will write their own part of it. You need to make sure that at the end, when you're looking at the full article, the 3 different parts, they flow well together. But more importantly, as your writer, depending on your level of writing as well, there are sometimes you make some spelling mistakes, or maybe you explain something, a concept that wasn't very clear to other people. But because it's a concept that you spend so much time with you, and because you're staring at that same piece of text for a while, you don't pick up small mistakes. So when you have a code review, it gives other engineers the chance, other eyes really, to look at your piece of text before putting everything together, which is what I was talking about the integration before. So that's one of the reasons why code review is important. The second thing, which I think in a very strong software team, people don't really think about that. Code review is important to make sure that people do things the right way and follow the principles. So one of the principles could be, if you're going to write your text, you need to put some comments so that the comments are things that other human will understand, but the computer doesn't understand. So I'm not even going to go into that. But you need to kind of explain what you're doing by using comments. When you're in a rush, we want to do things very quickly. The first thing that drops is comments. Now, if you have an article where there's different paragraphs and nobody really have titles for this paragraph, sometimes it's hard to know what was written or what was the content about. So having a code review makes sure that the person reviewing can say, okay, I understand what your code is, but please can you add some comments? And the other thing as well is what I would say, what kind of the grammar. And the grammar is also very important in programming. When you have code reviews, you can also make sure that people are using the right grammars by the right standards so that we avoid issues in the future. So some people might say it's a useless effort. I see that as another level of verification, both to make sure that we're building the right things, but to make sure that what we're building today is done in a way that 2 years, 3 years from now, another human can read that, understand, and pick it up very quickly. So that will lead me to the third really cool, good tip that you've mentioned, was having that external person. And I strongly believe in making sure that even if you're working with an outsourced team, that that's all of your development for you. If you have access to a CTO advisor, make sure that your CTO advisor can review the design documents, not the code, but the document, just like the requirement, the design document should say how the engineers are going to build this. So that needs to be reviewed by a CTO advisor so that they can make sure that they're not missing things out. And also, as a CTO advisor can also have a look at the code. They might not have the bandwidth to look at everything that's been written, depending on how the code is, but still having someone like that comes in now and again to do a quick review, a quick check, make sure that it gives you a bit more comfort as you're moving forward. Because of course, as a non-tech founder, I mean, even if you're a tech founder, you might still be developing code in a language that you might not understand, or you're not familiar with, or you haven't worked extensively in that area, in that domain. So that's why it's important to have the other person, and as Joel said, that person that can come in and pick up those kind of things and move forward with it.
Yeah, for sure. And one thing also that I would add on top of what you said, because you mentioned the commenting and actually documenting your work, and that's another part that I think often gets dropped in fast-paced development, is just any form of documentation. And then you might come to the close of the project and think, oh shoot, we need to document this. And that then it's really hard to redocument stuff at the end because you're trying to remember something you did several weeks, several months ago. So actually having that continuous process of documenting your work, what have you done, where have you put stuff, why have you made certain decisions, and it could be some of it is, or a lot of it is commenting in the code, even if it should be self-explanatory, as a lot of people say. But also, even simple stuff like, okay, what are the tools that we're using in part of it, what open source software have we integrated or not? There's this huge array that I think often gets forgotten about. And then, yeah, you don't want to leave that to the end. So I often see that one gets dropped early on.
Yes. Yeah, and that's a very good point. Do remember that if you are outsourcing work to external developers, eventually you might want to bring it in-house, or you might change development house. If you don't have the documentation, as Joe said, it will be really hard. It will take a long time for people called to the projects to come and jump in. And even if you are building in-house, the people move from companies, right? Or you will eventually hire more people as the company grows. So if you hire more people, the company growth is great. You don't want to stand still, because it's really difficult to go back and understand what they're doing. So just to finish off, there's two terminology. I'm not sure if we will have the time to cover the two, but I love both of them. So I will go for the first one. So I'm thinking at QA testing and DevOps, because those are the two things that I always get asked at what point a company should start thinking about QA testing and DevOps. And those are also the things that I see drops a lot when people either want to go faster or when people have a limited budget. But first, let's look at QA testing, as this was part of some of the good practices, Joel, that you currently use with your clients when you look at things that have been built. So how would you define QA testing, and what are the methods that you use in there to help making sure that you have the right quality of build?
Yeah, QA testing is really broad. We'll try and be really quick. I think it needs to be done frequently is one of the things. And I break it up into kind of 3 categories, I guess. So you've got kind of the regression testing, functionality testing side of it, which is just, does it complete the user requirement? Can I log in? Can I get to where I want to go? Has anything broken because of something we've added? That's like, I think, the easiest way to test, and it's one way that a lot of people work. I'd say that's a good place to start. Anyone can get involved in that, really. And then there's the other 2 that I think about a lot more, which are a bit harder, which is kind of like load testing. Can we handle 100,000 concurrent users? If you've ever used like the Be Real app, when they try to have everybody using it at the same time and nothing works, that's an example of someone should have done a bit more load testing there. And then there's kind of the security testing as well, which is probably a little bit more advanced even. And that's, how do we know what we're doing is safe? And there's some best practices, of course, to include in that. But I'd actually say, if it's going into the security side, you probably want someone that's really an expert in security testing to properly check that out, rather than trying it out some other way. I think those are the main 3 areas. And a lot of this you could also streamline using kind of test-driven development and CI/CD pipelines. But then we're going to go into a whole kettle of fish of other terms. So that's what I think about a lot in QA.
Yeah, no, definitely. So those are kind of the main different types of testing. And of course, as you're going down or deep down into each category, there's all array of testing. And sometimes people wonder which one are important, which one are not important, which one to drop. But of course, this is where things like DevOps come into play, because it helps you to think about the operation behind the development, which is what DevOps really means, and how can you streamline or automate certain things so that you can tackle as many of these types of testing without doing everything manually, and also having a process that you can follow so that everybody's always on the same page. Now, one key thing for me, I would say, again, I'm wearing my developer's hat. When I work with a new technical team, whether they're outsourced and I'm representing the clients, I'm working with them. That's what I'm doing for one of my clients. When we were first having a discussion, even before we started building, I spent a lot of time talking about this QA testing so that they can even send me more information about written information. We talked about documentation on how they do that. So if you are a non-technical founder, do ask for that, and then you can get a CTO advisor or someone that you know in the tech world to give a bit of a green light. those more things might not sound very important, but when you start looking at the maturity level of a company or of a technical department, those are the things that can tell you, or when you can start picking the great teams or the strong team from the weakest team, or as your company is growing, you might not have all of the different types of testing that Joel's mentioned when you first start. But as you're getting more investments and as you want to go to the higher level or the next level of investments, and you're thinking, what are the things that we need to do to run better, then start thinking about integrating that. The second thing I will always ask, please ask as well about unit testing, automated unit testing. If that cannot be done, then you should worry. Unless you're obviously building in-house, then you should think about how to bring the capacity of writing unit tests in-house. If it's being outsourced, a lot of the company I work with when I outsource, they do have that. But again, like I said before, those are the questions I asked before. It's great to be able to test the functionality with the entire flow. So if I'm booking a flight, this is the screen that says put the dates, and then this is the screen that shows me the price. You want to test the full thing. But as an engineer, one thing we need to test is that each screen on its own, or each function, or each tiny component works really well. So if we go back to the car analogy, even before I put the tire on the car, I want to make sure that the tire it's on its own. It works really well. There's nothing wrong. There's no like, I don't know, the air will escape or whatever wrong can go with tires. No, I'm not a mechanic, but that is also something that we do as engineers. So that's why it's important to have that, and we call it unit testing. So yeah, so I think those are kind of the type of questions. Even if you are not an expert, just asking these questions get people to go like, yeah, they know what they're talking about. You might not, that's no problem, because at least you've asked, they've answered, they've written it down, and then you can go and give it to someone else who can confirm or make sure that, yes, they're doing the right thing.
Yeah, for sure. And unit testing is a really good point. I think definitely needs including more often.
Yes. Well, I wanted to tackle the DevOps, but I have to let you go because we've already been going over time on this. But I'm definitely going to touch up on DevOps and having a little bit more conversation on that. I think there will be 2 episodes after this one. Sorry, I can't remember numbers now. So if you are watching live, do come back in 2 weeks, because I've got our guest is a CTO expert. So the way we've structured the conversation is that today we've talked about the jargon. We've looked at it from a non-technical mindset, what kind of thing you need to look at, and the technical mindset as well. And then in 2 weeks, we are diving deeper, still the same topics, but then going into certain elements where it's more focused on the technical aspects of different things, but still from the hat of, if I'm a founder, I don't have time to look at absolutely everything, but what can I do? So we have great guests that are coming on those. So please do watch both episodes, because for me, they are complementary, as we have so many great tips that Joel has shared with us today, and so many great discussions in these episodes. And we have more coming out in 2 weeks as well. And for anybody out there who knows a founder that probably struggling with all of the concepts that we have talked about, do remember that we run monthly advisory sessions where we focus on the tech and the product to help you get unstuck. Whether you want to come in on the session, you come with us, and we also have other guest mentors. Do watch out, because I'm still to get Joel to come on one of the sessions. So that would be brilliant if you're ever interested to meet him there as well. And we'll be happy to help you to get going. And again, Joel, thank you so much for coming on the show. How can people find out more about you?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to speak with you on this. I think the best place to find me is on LinkedIn, Joel Yeap. I'm there. If not, you can find me at yap.tech. That's my site, and would love to speak to you about anything to do with building impact projects. So yeah.
Brilliant. And do remember, everybody, let's design a happy and productive workplace playground together.